right into it and answer all of these questions. Perhaps I should start with an introduction. I don't know. That wasn't in the instructions or not, but seems appropriate. I'm Kylie Banks, a registered psychotherapist qualifying in a little place called London in Canada, not the cool one in Great Britain, unfortunately. And I'm going to answer some questions around some trans and gender nonconforming topics that I see a lot. And yeah, hopefully it's helpful. And so in the first batch of questions are kind of more around mental healthy kind of stuff for trans people. So I guess I will start there kind of in one stream of answers. Yeah, so I mean, there are so many different issues that, come up as it pertains to trans and gender nonconforming people as it presents in terms of their mental health when I see them for counseling. And I mean, I could rattle off the list for you. Pretty much every academic article or book written about counseling with this population will, have paragraphs and upon paragraphs talking about like, this is a group that has an elevated risk of depression or anxiety, PTSD, the list goes on and on, eating disorders, whatever. But as a psychotherapist, I look at that a little bit differently. I'm not somebody who applies the labels like a psychologist or a psychiatrist might. I'm the person who works with you on what you're going through talk therapy. And so I'm maybe a little less interested in what the label that you may carry is, and what drives that label is much more important to me. Let's get to the root of that to try and resolve that issue. And when it comes to this population, I think the thing for, there's lots of different things that could drive it for somebody. But I think maybe one of the most common things would be the concept of shame. I think a lot of people in in these groups carry a lot of shame around who they are because they've had to forever from a very young age. And internalize that, right? And when we think of the concept of shame, we think of it's around I'm bad, something's wrong with me, I'm unlovable, or something along those lines, right? And so you've got a group of people who very early in their life realize there's something wrong or something different about them, and maybe there's not that support or that, affirming environment to make you feel better about it. You feel like an outcast, you feel like something's different, something's wrong. And yeah, that really internalizes into shame in the sense of I'm bad, something's wrong with me. And a lot of trans or gender nonconforming people will carry that for a long time, very overwhelmed by that, want to hide it, don't know what to do with it. And eventually there is some sort of resolution. And, people come to some sort of acceptance around their identity and they come out, which is great. But that's not necessarily like, in my experience, completely resolves everything, right? I think there's still a lot of hangover from a lifetime of trying to deal with shame that people can get really, really stuck in. And usually there's two different ways that I tend to see that. People will either overcompensate to try and cope with feelings of shame, or they'll just try to avoid a lot of things that could elicit feelings of shame. The most classic ways of overcompensating for something like shame, I mean, the most classic is narcissism, right? I feel like shit, so I, act like I'm the greatest thing on the planet. But there's lots of other ways, things that people tend to lean into that are similar to that, like a perfectionism or, putting, fully investing in their career or something like that and disregarding other areas of their life. Because if I'm successful in certain areas, there's nothing wrong with me, right? That's one way that people do that. The other is obviously avoidance of anything that could elicit shame. And so you take yourself out of situations where that those feelings could be triggered in any way, right? So maybe I don't show up authentically in my friendships or attempt to try and have a relationship with somebody or pursue the career that I really want to pursue or the hobbies that I really want to pursue. Maybe I don't present myself how I truly feel that I am, because again, if somebody judges me, then I might feel that shame, and it's just like, ugh, such a gross feeling. I want to kind of run and hide. And people can spend the rest of their life kind of stuck either overcompensating or avoiding shame, and keeps them away from really being authentically who they are, right? When I work with people around their transitions and stuff like that, it's not about going from male to female, female to male, binary to non-binary, whatever. That's part of it, obviously, but it's about how do we let a false sense of self recede and allow an authentic self to emerge. And honestly, that's a very painful process because it involves confronting some of those negative feelings, the anxieties, the shame, the guilt. etc. But yeah, obviously, it's trying to establish a really good relationship with somebody where they feel safe enough to confront those topics and then take that from the therapy room into their day-to-day life is something that I think is like vitally, vitally important in the work I do. So to answer that much more briefly, an issue that I think is really important with this group of people is shame. In terms of like if there's certain approaches or techniques that I tend to favor in terms of working with trans people, not necessarily. I think from an just like think of it from an academic perspective, I think testing certain approaches to therapy with this group of people, trans people, is still a relatively kind of new thing to do. I mean, we've been a pretty highly marginalized group for a very long time until very recently, right? So I don't think there's necessarily even like the knowledge base out there to be like, oh, this is really good, right? And maybe someday that will come. Some really basic principles are what I try to follow when working with, trans people. And the biggest one is being, what we would call kind of founded in person-centered types of therapy, where it's really the client drives the bus, and I have to be, make sure I stay in a place of, unconditional positive regard and having empathy and being congruent emotionally. And I think that's really important because everybody's story and journey with their gender identity and stuff can be so unique. There's not just like one particular archetype, and that's how it has to be, right? That's how it used to be, in the 70s or 80s or something, right? There was a specific tale you would have to tell the psychiatrist or doctor if you wanted to get access to hormones or things like that, right? And obviously that ruined a lot of fucking people's lives, because obviously there's much more diversity in there. So I think, being really open and just kind of to whatever experiences come there is really important. And honestly, like, it would be easy to think of like a cisgender therapist. Maybe that's really, difficult for them because they don't know much. Maybe everything they know is what they read from a textbook. Fair. I think it's even harder as a trans person myself, because I could so easily just project my sense of what being, a transsexual is or whatever onto my clients, right? So I have to be super duper mindful of that, maybe even more so than a cisgender therapist, right? Of like, everyone who comes in, their narrative is so different from mine, right? And I can't be sitting here and validating them for that. Who am I? I'm not the arbiter of who is the real transsexual and who isn't, or what does it really mean to be non-binary or gender queer. I don't fucking know. And so you have to be open to letting other people kind of define themselves. So there's that. I think another thing in terms of like a specific approach or technique that I do bring in quite a bit because I think it fits is a lot of my stuff I practice from a very existential lens, which isn't all just about death and dying. I think there's a lot of things when you approach things existentially is about choice and having the freedom to make choices, but also having to deal with the consequences that may come from that, right? And none of us choose to be trans or gay or whatever, but there's choices in how we go about that and what we choose to do and what we don't choose to do, right? Some people choose to not transition, people choose to detransition. There's, so many different ways to go, right? And people have to deal with that, where it's like, I have the freedom to choose, but also do I want to deal with those consequences? And I think we'll get into that a little bit when I talk about like, coming out to family or people being supportive and whatnot. How do I help people with the stresses of dating and relationships and things of that sort when, you yourself are trans or some other unique gender identity? It's tough to give a super holistic answer to that because, again, there are so many different unique scenarios that come up for me. I think the overarching thing that I think is so important when it comes to dating is checking on where my clients are in terms of their self-esteem and self-worth. Because if we don't like ourselves very much, we're probably not going to make the greatest choices in the dating realm. And I think I'm thinking of my trans girls in particular. I'm just as guilty of this, right? If you don't feel very good about yourself, you're probably going to settle, and it's not that hard to settle in terms of the types of people out there who might want to date you, who maybe don't see you as a whole person, and they see you more as just like a sex object or something like that. So I think it's really important to kind of, really focus on those things. And those are two different things. Here's a little psychology 101. Like, self-esteem and self-worth are two very different constructs. Self-esteem is very much an external thing. I feel good about myself because I've got a great job and lots of money and a sexy partner and a nice car or whatever. That's self-esteem. That goes up and down throughout the course of our life, and it's often based on external things. Whereas self-worth is more of just an internal sense of I'm okay. I deserve to be loved because of who I am. Like, I may be flawed, but I'm okay. That kind of thing. And it's really important to have both of them, especially the self-worth piece, because self-esteem fluctuates, right? So maybe I think I'm hot as shit because I've just got the perfect bikini body for summer or something like that. But then, so I feel great about myself. But what happens if, I get in a car accident and then I can't keep working out for 3 months and I put on 10 pounds? Self-esteem is going to take a hit. And when that takes a hit, you got to have something else there that makes you know you're okay other than just your body, right? And that's where that self-worth piece comes in. And when people have self-worth, they tend to, they stick to their standards, right? They can stick to their boundaries as well. They don't settle and things of that sort. So that's something that I check on quite a bit and I think is really important in a dating context. I would say, a question that I think is very natural in this moment is, well, how the hell do you get self-worth or feel better about yourself? And people tend not to like the answer to that because it really comes from, I guess at the end of the day, you could say self-love is where that comes from. But if you were to break that down, it comes from self-compassion and self-acceptance. The ability to, when you can get to a place where you can accept yourself despite flaws or mistakes or things that you make, we tend to feel a bit better about ourselves. And the same thing as well with self-compassion, right? Like not completely kicking the shit out of myself because of the mistake that I made or some sort of thing that came up, or maybe I wasn't as successful at something as I had hoped, right? The ability to be kind to ourselves in those moments allows us to feel a little better and a little worthy. And and I just want to say right now, that's a really fucking hard journey to figure that out, because most people, especially if they carry lots of shame, have a really hard time being compassionate towards themselves. But when you can learn that, you can really transform how you feel about yourself. And then you're not going to be the kind of person who settles or, let somebody really take advantage of you. You're able to identify when somebody's mistreating you a lot better. So I would say that the self-worth piece is big in terms of dating. In terms of specific issues in the dating realm whilst being trans that I tend to work with a lot, I think there's two that come up very frequently. One is specific to trans women in terms of how they deal with the men who are attracted to them and the challenges that are often presented in those kinds of dynamics. And I will talk about that a little bit later in one of my responses, so we'll get to that. And the other one is a lot about somebody who's transitioning, starting their transition while currently having a partner. And right now, most of my clients who are in that position are people who are starting a male to female transition, so my young trans girls who already have a partner, many of which are cis women. So kind of in a hetero dynamic, now going to a lesbian dynamic, and how do we manage that? And again, it's going to be very specific in terms of, the unique dynamics there that are. So for example, if, you're transitioning and your partner who's the cis woman who is heterosexual and that's not changing, you officially have a sexual compatibility issue in most cases, right? And how do we work around that, and what do you want to do about that, right? And lots of couples in that situation will break up. And then so with me and the client, it's a lot of grief processing in terms of that relationship ending. Sometimes maybe it works out. I mean, there are certainly people who stay together despite sexual incompatibility issues. I know for many people that would be hard to fathom, but that does actually happen. Another thing is there's also lots of time where the partner in question, the cis girl in the example I'm thinking of here, maybe it kind of opens their mind a little bit. That's surprisingly common. I see that quite frequently where someone's I love this person so much, I think I would still love them if they transition from male to female or something of that nature, right? So, I mean, there's so many different directions that can go in, and really, for me, I have to have this kind of hands-off, let's see where it goes kind of approach. because it's such a massive adjustment. Obviously, for my client who is in the process of transition, they're going through the biggest adjustment in their life they'll ever go through. But at the same time, too, for a partner, especially if it's a very serious relationship, we're married, we've been together for years, we live together, etc., etc. Massive change. So that ability to kind of just slowly navigate and see where various parties are at. And it's hard too, right? You can't really jump to conclusions because things can change, right? So again, say I have a client, young trans girl starting her transition, who's with a cis girl or whatnot. Maybe my client, 6 months, a year into their transition realizes they're only attracted to men. So now we've got to cross a whole new bridge, right? And there's no map for how to do that appropriately. And I will say, if you are one of these people who has gone through a transition or considering going through your transition and are with a partner, bless your soul. You are so brave. I did not date people for like 5 years before I transitioned because I didn't want to deal with that. I don't know, maybe I'm a coward, or more realistically, that's just a really, really a difficult thing to do, and it's really challenging to navigate. So, I mean, one thing I get asked a ton is from clients of mine who are at the very start of a transition, about to go through that process, will ask me about, how do I come out to my family? How do I come out to my partner? How do I come out to my friends? And those kinds of things. Which, always puts me in a weird position because my answer to that deep down in my soul is, I don't fucking know. In my own journey, it just sort of happened. I just sort of did it, right? There wasn't some grand plan or anything that was super well thought out, right? And so it's hard, right? Because I can never tell somebody what they need to say. And it's very fascinating because I can really appreciate this. Almost, I don't want to say all the time, but almost all the time, people will ask me about that as though I can give them something to say that will guarantee a good response from whoever they're telling, right? And that's obviously a misnomer, because if there was just a sentence or a paragraph I could convey to somebody and they would totally get it, there would be no transphobia, right? You would just say the paragraph and I'd be like, oh, right, you're a human being, I should respect you. And unfortunately, we don't live in that world, right, where that's not a thing. So often when people approach me with that, that kind of question, right, it's a lot about exploring, well, what do you want to tell them, right? And again, right, how can I get you to a place where you can be as authentic as you need to be, right? And I think that's really the biggest challenge for a lot of people, because they may know who they are and what they want to say, but they're balancing that against, how can I present it in a way that is easily digestible for the other person on the other end so they will accept me. And obviously, yeah, we want our close relationships to work out and those people to still love us or whatnot. But it's how you present it. Are you being inauthentic in order to get that person to still, respect you or love you or care about you, right? And does that do more harm than good in the long run, or does it not, right? So it's, I don't really have a way to come out to people to offer. But certainly a big piece is around exploring those kinds of things, right? Okay, so you know what you want, but you feel you have to kind of editorialize it for mom and dad or whoever, right? Is that something you can live with? Are you okay with that? And maybe you are, right? Again, no right or wrong answer. It's about exploring those different options. I would say, again, like, I don't really have any advice on what to do about that, right? Again, just exploring. But one thing I do see a lot that I would just throw out there to be mindful of is everybody is always looking for the perfect time to tell somebody. And the reality of it is there is no perfect time, right? I can understand if it's, you're at your brother's wedding and maybe you don't think that's the greatest time to let him know on the happiest day of his life or whatever. Absolutely. But I've had so many different clients, it's like, well, I'm going to tell my parents, but my mom's a little stressed out at work, so I'm going to push it off. And then it's 2 weeks later and, well, dad's got knee surgery next week. So then you push it off. And then this just keeps happening over and over again. I've worked with clients where months upon months go by, right? Where there's always a reason. And that speaks to how difficult it is, the process of coming out, right? To constantly have those kinds of excuses for why it's not the right time. So in terms of advice, I would certainly offer that out there. If you are somebody who's constantly coming up with reasons for why it's not the right time, maybe look inward as to why you keep having those reasons. um, and I don't say that, hopefully that doesn't come off in like a judgy, I'm, judging people who do that kind of way. Because again, like I said, it's a very difficult thing to have to do, right? You're going to go up to people who are very close to you, and you are running the risk of them looking at you in a very different way, rejecting you, no longer loving you, or something like that. So I appreciate the fear. Unfortunately, it's kind of like the monster under your bed when you're a little kid, right? The more you avoid, taking the flashlight and looking under your bed and realizing there's no monster, the monster gets bigger and bigger and bigger in your mind. And you eventually got to rip that Band-Aid off and go look, or in this case, actually tell people or come out, right? And so everybody has to decide when the right time for them is, right? I really just help them reflect on what that process tends to be looking like for them. I think another thing, too, that's really important to be mindful of is, again, just be as real as you can for right now. Because I think if you talk to a lot of trans people, I transitioned, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that. If you were to ask me to describe my journey or my gender or whatever the fuck today versus the day that I told my mom or my dad or whoever, very different ways of responding. If you asked me 5 years ago when I was to say that, I probably would have had some sort of like very rambling, trying to get mom to understand sort of diatribe. If you were to ask me today, I'd be like, there was a blue team and I didn't like that. I wanted to be on the pink team. And that's about it, right? And very matter of fact. And so holding space for the fact that how you maybe describe who you are could change over time, right? The nuances and whatnot. I think that's really important as well. Because I think, again, you're trying to get people to understand. So there's this want to get it right and have it all explained, and everything needs to be very consistent. And it's just like, that's not how life actually works, unfortunately. And so we need to be able to hold space that this is what I need to convey today. Maybe it's not my story for the rest of my life. So now we're getting into the really fun questions here in terms of like specific stuff around being trans and dating as it pertains to people who may be interested romantically in trans people. And I'm really hijacking this little interview here right now to speak from my scorned transsexual woman perspective, but also many of my clients as well. Because as I alluded to earlier, this is a really big issue for a lot of trans women who date men and things of that sort, where there's lots of men who are very uncomfortable with their attraction to trans women, right? There's that, does it make me gay, or kind of, that, am I less of a man? Those kinds of narratives, right? And I think it really does in many ways harken back to that shame thing I was talking about before, right? This really, something's different about me, because I think if you're a cisgender man, you're expected to grow up and want to fuck cis women and marry a cis woman and all those kinds of things. And anything that strays from that speaks to some sort of fundamental flaw in you. And we can sit here intellectually and know that's a load of bullshit, right? Like, you can love whoever you love and want to fuck the brains out of whoever you want to fuck the brains out of. But on an emotional level, right, that can be very difficult in terms of self-concept and things of that sort. And so it's really difficult because, a man is really struggling with his feelings around that, and it really can tend to hurt the trans woman in this kind of situations, feeling not wanted, right? Like, I think when we're in a relationship with somebody, whoever you are, you want your partner to claim you, right? You're mine, I'm yours, You're gonna hold my hand when we walk together in the park, not just be some dirty little secret behind closed doors. But unfortunately, that's something that plays out a ton. And so I think that's really kind of something I want to address here, because I think it's such a big issue. What is exactly the kind of advice or guidance that I would give for a man in particular interested in a trans woman? And I think, this advice is not my own. This was given to me before I was a therapist. I may have dabbled in the sex work industry. And one of my producers on a video shoot once kind of told me a story about what he would tell his guy friends who wanted to get him, like, how to hook up with the trans girls that he would film, right? Because he's a producer for one of the bigger trans porn companies, and he's got all these buddies of, like, how can I fuck some of the girls or whatever. And he's telling me this story about how he would tell them, it's like, I'm not gonna, like, help you try and fuck these girls. Like, if they're escorts and you want to hire them, yeah, I'll give you their info, you'll pay some money, you'll have a great time. These girls are wild. But, like, if you actually, like, want to get with the girl, like, you can't just do that. You can't just try and kind of shoot your shot and try and get laid or whatnot. Like, you actually have to show some semblance of understanding of what their lives are like, right? Because, you know, trans people, we have to make so many sacrifices just to be who we are, right? People lose families, jobs, careers, things of that sort, friends, partners, as a result of us trying to be who our authentic selves are, right? And if you can't really take the time to really appreciate that, appreciate the person, appreciate them as a human being, just, like, hire an escort and leave it at that, right? And I think that's really true, right? Because I think you know, if you can't resolve that kind of shame piece around what does it mean if I'm dating a trans woman or something like that, then maybe just leave it to the professional kind of sex work side of things, right? Yeah, if you are actually romantically interested, maybe having some semblance of awareness of, you know, what the lives of trans girls are like and what they go through and the things that they have to deal with, right? I think the bar is set quite low for men in that kind of situation. You'd be surprised how impressed some of the dolls would be by actually being willing to kind of really, really understand their perspective and what they've been through, right? And at the end of the day, that's what everybody wants, regardless of, you know, gender identity, sexual orientation, right? We want to be seen for who we are and appreciated for who we are. And unfortunately for trans people, that's just something that tends to be quite rare. And so I think that's an important thing to identify. What are some misconceptions about dating in this realm if you are someone who is interested in trans people? And again, I'm going to stick with my little trans woman rant here. Apologies to all the other identities out there. Because again, I think this is a big one that I run into a lot with clients and in my own personal life, if I can be selfish, is particularly as it pertains to men who are into trans women. Everything you see, porn, I'm just going to say this, porn is not reality, just so you know. And so I think a lot of, you know, and I say that kind of jokingly, but there's something very serious about that. This is changing now in the year 2023 of our Lord and Savior. But historically, a lot of men's exposure to transsexuals, trans women, and things of that nature has been through porn, right? And so I think trans women are so incredibly fetishized and objectified, and then, but just also just solely viewed through that lens. So there's this assumption that, you know, trans girls, trans women are just all hypersexual and they are going to do all the things that you see in your favorite videos with Daisy Taylor. Okay, it took me about 7 seconds to think of a trans porn star. I'm a little rusty. And so, you know, that's setting yourself up for failure because, you know, plot twist here, people are very unique and have a lot of different interests, right? And I think the best example is if you watch trans porn, like the whole gimmick generally is this a chick with a dick, right? And cum shots and just lots of close-ups on that. And the guy going down on her, the girl topping the guy, right? Just because that's what you see in videos and stuff, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what every trans girl you're going to meet is going to be into that, right? Some girls will, which is great, cool, awesome, love that. But I think, I mean, you know, plot twist, lots of trans women are dysphoric about having a penis and therefore maybe don't want that to be a part of, you know, sex and sexuality. Maybe their lifelong goal is to get surgery so they can have a vagina, right? And so, you know, if part of your trying to court or attempt to get the gals, you know, revolves around, you know, expecting those kinds of things, you will be, you know, it's not going to go well and you're probably going to come off as kind of dehumanizing, right? So that's one thing in general just to be mindful of. And again, like, this goes for any sort of group of people. You know, you need to be able to communicate about those things with people. Like, say you take a trans girl on a date or something like that, and it goes really well. And if you assume that means she is going to fulfill all your great fantasies from something that you saw online or whatever, you know, that might not come to fruition. So it's important to be able to discuss those things, right? So yeah, I think, you know, and I don't even necessarily want to be super duper mean and blame men who are into trans girls, as we would call a tranny chaser. Because again, I think historically it's, you know, we live in a very transphobic world where we have been very marginalized, right? And so that is all for the longest period of time. That's the only place that you would ever even see any sort of representation of transsexual women is through porn, right? And so, you know, I hope as we move forward in this more progressive world, we see, you know, I'm a fucking, you know, if this was 30 years ago, I would probably not be a therapist. You know, I don't know if I could make it above, you know, sex worker or something like that, right? And so as we become kind of more diffuse in the world, hopefully there's a little less of that. But yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions is just, yeah, what dudes see in porn. I'm sorry, but it's pretty much as simple as that.